Let me set the stage. You're a citizen out in one of the hundreds of towns sprinkled around the Great Lakes in the 1800s. Maybe you're just living the simple life of a farmer, tending to your crops. Or you're a lumberjack, supplying the lumber that fuels the construction booms of New York, Philadelphia, Buffalo, and Chicago. It's not the easiest life, but you're managing to make ends meet. It's a little before 9 p.m., and you're just turning in for the night when a low rumbling sound, like a passing locomotive, catches your ear. You and your family race out of the house and are greeted by the sight not far off the Bible's description of Armageddon. The entire forest around your sleepy little town is ablaze with flames, reaching past the tops of the tallest trees, their glow turning the sky a blood red. Grabbing your kids as the wall of flames races towards you at speeds nothing made by God or man can outpace, the air glows thick with smoke as embers rain down from the sky and begin to ignite the roofs of nearby buildings. All around you, panic sets in as friends and neighbors flee in all directions. Others just drop to their knees and begin to pray, paralyzed by fear. It's getting difficult to breathe now, and you can feel your skin beginning to blister from the heat. Your only hope is to head to the river and pray you can reach the water before the fire does. Let me start this video off with a question. What was the deadliest fire in U.S. history? Your first thought is probably the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of March 25th, 1911, especially if you're part of the audience that isn't part of the fire service. Makes sense. That's one of the few fires everybody learns about at school because it was the driving force behind a lot of early fire safety laws. As horrific as that tale of those 146 garment workers was, though, it doesn't even crack the top 20 for deadliest fires in American history. Your next guess might be the Coconut Grove nightclub fire of November 28, 1942. The Boston nightclub, stuffed to twice its legal capacity with soldiers enjoying their last few days of leave before going off to war, left 492 dead after an electrical short ignited flammable fake palm trees used as decorations. Well, now you're in the top 5 at least, but you're not even at the deadliest single structure fire in American history. That honor belongs to a fire that occurred at the Iroquois Theater in Chicago on December 30th, 1903. 605 theatergoers, actors, and employees lost their lives when a curtain in this supposedly fireproof theater ignited. Many were crushed to death by panicking crowds in the main stairway as patrons struggled to find and unlock the emergency exits. All 3 of these fires combined still doesn't reach the death toll of the fire we're looking for. So let me give you a hint. It has to do with October 8th, 1871. No, it's not the Great Chicago Fire. Yes, I know that's the date the fire started. And yes, I know that unlike many other great fires I could name, even when overlaid with a modern map of Chicago, the damage was extensive. And finally, yes, I know that Chicago has done everything in its power to ensure that every school child 1,000 years from now will still learn about that fire. See, despite doing $220 million worth of property damage, the fire only killed 300 people. In fact, depending on which sources you use, the Great Chicago Fire is only the 3rd deadliest fire that day. To go to the deadliest fire in U.S. history, you need to travel 250 miles north to a sleepy little town just north of Green Bay, Wisconsin. Peshtigo is a small town of approximately 4,000 people in Marinette County, Wisconsin, situated on the western shore of Green Bay. Back in 1871, 1,749 people, mostly immigrants from Germany and Scandinavia, lived in this town. Hundreds more lived in encampments in the surrounding hills as they plied their trade in the area's primary industry. Lumber. What, you thought all those cow pastures were natural landscape? No. Before becoming the dairy state, Wisconsin started as a lumber state. In fact, at this point, Wisconsin was the leading timber producer in the nation. Sawmills and woodenware factories dotted the land, including Peshtigo, where former Chicago Mayor William Ogden staked his fortunes. The state's white pine in particular was prized for its size and ability to grow straight. And like all industries, there was a lot of waste. Pine cones, pine needles, stumps, branches too small and crooked to be used for anything. This waste, known as slash, tended to accumulate on the job sites in large piles. How large, you might ask? Well, there are accounts of these piles stretching for acres, with the debris piled 10 to 15 feet high. With this being the 1800s, the most common way of getting rid of these piles, of course, was by burning them. It was quick, easy, and the ashes made excellent fertilizer for the soil, allowing the crops to be planted sooner on the cleared land. There's only one small problem with these fires. The fall of 1871 was a really, Really bad time to be setting acre-sized mulch fires in the middle of the forest. Now, the main reason should have been evident to the residents of Peshtigo and the surrounding area. The signs were all around them. For the better part of 2 years, the entire Great Lakes region had been gripped by a drought, turning it into a tinderbox. The rivers were so low that logs couldn't be transported down them to the mills, and streams and marshes had almost completely dried up. The forests were little more than oven-dried kindling, waiting to burn. This led to a string of fires in the lead-up to October 8th. Prairie fires ravaged Nebraska and Iowa in September, and what would become known as the Great Prairie Fire started in western Minnesota on October 5th. In the week before the Great Chicago Fire, the city's fire department would be run ragged by over 30 confirmed structure fires. Peshtigo had been suffering from smaller fires for most of the summer and fall. Smoke hung over the town like a gray blanket, but the townsfolk and loggers had gotten used to it, seeing it as more of an annoyance than a danger. On September 24th, at least 3 massive fires broke out in the area between Green Bay and Marinette on the Wisconsin-Michigan border. The telegraph line was cut, and in Peshtigo, the local sawmill in town had only been saved by a timely shift of the wind. In the aftermath, most of the area mills had been shut down for safety, and volunteers had been fortifying the town by placing water barrels on the outskirts for easy access when the next fire came. Had the last piece of what became known as the Peshtigo paradigm not fallen into place, they may have actually had a chance. A mass of warm air driven by a cyclone that had just struck Texas was rushing north on a collision course with the cold front moving in from the Canadian plains, set to collide over Wisconsin and the Great Lakes. Due to the damage to the telegraphs, meteorologists in Milwaukee and Chicago were unable to receive reports of the severity of the fires in Peshtigo, and no weather reports about these systems were reaching the town. No one could put all the pieces together and see the rapture that was about to descend on the area. As the citizens of Peshtigo and the surrounding towns went about their daily activities, the storm system approached, sending 40-mile-per-hour gale force winds down the length of Green Bay. They didn't pay much attention to the approaching storm clouds, though, as they went about their Sunday routines. A few even believed their prayers had been answered, that rains of salvation were on their way. Instead, all that was approaching were the winds of damnation. With the fires that had been burning underground for the last few weeks still smoldering, the ground was radiating enough heat to create a powerful updraft that forced moisture and precipitation higher into the clouds. This mass of hot air settled over northeastern Wisconsin, smothering Peshtigo and the other towns. Ash and smoke choked the entire bay, reducing visibility to less than 15 feet. As the clock struck 8 p.m., the winds picked up to 65 miles per hour. All across the Midwest, people later reported vegetation spontaneously combusting as the weather system settled over the Great Lakes. This wind was all the fires still burning in the root systems underground needed to take off. These ground fires sprang up from burnt stumps and cracks in the dry ground to the surface, and from there jumped to the treetops to form a crown fire. Those white pines that had once made the region a logging Eden now transformed it into Sodom and Gomorrah, their sap acting like natural napalm as it is picked up by the wind and thrown back to the ground in burning droplets like hellfire, igniting everything and everyone it touched. Within minutes, fires had broken out all over the area encompassing most of the southern half of Oconto County. The fires began moving northeast and converged, creating one of the most terrifying phenomena in wildland firefighting: a firestorm. And just what is a firestorm, you might ask? Well, imagine a hurricane. Now imagine that hurricane made of nothing but fire. At this point, the fire is burning so hot and over such a large area that it creates its own winds to sustain itself. Driven by winds of its own making that were later estimated to be over 100 miles per hour, the firestorm raced along the western shore of Green Bay towards Peshtigo, Marinette, and the Michigan border. Back in Peshtigo, those townsfolk who were still awake watched as the orange glow settled over the town. Fires were soon reported in the woods on all sides by farmers fleeing them, and flames could be seen on the horizon. Some made their way to the river out of caution, others dug fire breaks around their homes, and local priest, Father Perrin, rushed to the church to grab the holy relics. Others turned in for the night, convinced that the burnt trees that surrounded Peshtigo would protect it from the worst of the flames. A few volunteers pulled the handcart out, preparing for a night of stamping out embers and the occasional spot fire. In a few minutes, they would abandon their posts and run for their lives for the river. And when I'm done explaining what's about to happen to Peshtigo, you won't blame them. First came the fireballs. Tree stumps and other debris ripped from the forest floor and catapulted through the air by those 100-mile-an-hour winds, launched into the town like something out of the Lord of the Rings. Then came the radiant heat. Windows shattered, and pine tar-covered roof shingles ignited while the fire was still hundreds of yards away. The pump handles on that lone fire cart began to glow a bright amber as volunteers and the rest of the townsfolk still standing around fled towards the river in panic, a low rumble like a freight train echoing through the valley. And then the main body of the fire arrived. A 5-mile-long wall of fire nearly 300 feet tall, bringing along a fire tornado with it that burst out of the tree line. Let me be clear, at this point there wasn't a fire department on Earth that could have stopped this thing. Hell, today there isn't a fire department on Earth that could fight this. There's only one thing you can do when a firestorm develops, and that is stay the hell out of its way. Now I need to preface this next part with two things. First, there's no way to sugarcoat hundreds of people burning to death in less time than it takes to make a cup of instant noodles. Some of the things I'm going to describe are graphic, and if you wish to skip ahead, the timestamp to do so is on the screen right now. Secondly, it's going to take more time for me to describe the destruction of Peshtigo than it will take for the destruction to have occurred. Peshtigo was a lumber town. Its buildings were made of wood, its roofs sealed with pine tar, and sawdust was so plentiful that it was used as mattress padding, insulation, and to line the roads. When the firestorm hit the town at 8:45 p.m., it didn't burn, it disintegrated. One phrase repeats itself over and over again in survivor accounts, faster than it takes to write these words. Buildings were ripped off their foundations and torn to pieces by the wind, their burning debris scattered amongst the forest. People were launched into the air as their clothes and hair spontaneously combusted, making them look like comets as they flew screaming through the sky. Others dropped dead to the ground as 2,000-degree temperatures flash-seared their lungs with a single breath. Women and girls in particular found themselves vulnerable to the flames, as their hair and dresses acted like candle wicks. Everyone ran to the river, trampling to death those unlucky enough to trip or stumble in front of the panicked crowds. Parents, realizing there was no hope of reaching the water, were seen slitting their own kids' throats before turning the knives on themselves rather than subject them to the flames. Even those that made it to the Peshtigo River, which bisected the town, found little comfort as the flames raced past it to torch the northern bank. A blast of superheated steam hit those at the water's surface, boiling them alive. Others drowned or were burnt to death when the floating logs they were hanging on to ignited. For weeks after the fire, intact legs and lower torsos would wash ashore downstream, the upper halves having been charred to ashes. After treating the Peshtigo River like a jump rope, the fire continued its path of destruction through the north side of town. Then, as quickly as the firestorm had arrived, the storm was on its way to Marinette and the Michigan border, before losing steam, leaving a path of hellfire in its wake. Almost the entirety of Green Bay was burning at this point. The fires were so bright that schooners were unable to distinguish the lighthouses from them and crashed into the rocky shore. Over on the eastern shore, another firestorm broke out near New Franken on the Dore Peninsula. At the time, the firestorm was assumed to be part of the same one that had leveled Peshtigo, but today is considered a separate fire. The destruction there was no less than what occurred at Peshtigo at the same time. The town in Williamsville was literally wiped off the map. Only 19 of its 87 residents would survive to see October 9th, and the town was so thoroughly destroyed that surveyors would struggle to find its exact location for decades after the fire. On the morning of October 9th, the citizens of Marinette stumbled into the street. The fire had burned stuff out sometime around midnight, and although 14 buildings had been destroyed, most of the town and its residents had survived unharmed. As they began to clear the streets of debris, loggers from the camps around Peshtigo stumbled into town. Faces blackened by soot and short of breath, they reported that the town was no more. Newspaper publisher Luther B. Nosey, believing that the reports were exaggerations, rode into town to see for himself. The Civil War veteran later compared the scenes of destruction he found to Cold Harbor, one of the deadliest battles of the war. Peshtigo was gone. Only a few fragments of civilization remained amongst the charred landscape. A few scorched train car axles were the only proof that the woodenware factory had ever existed. The train cars themselves burnt to ash along with the buildings. Church bells were found melted into slag, and nobody could even begin to count the number of dead. Survivors were quickly transported to Marinette and Green Bay, where they overwhelmed the makeshift hospitals as soon as they were being established. Most died of renal failure or secondary infections from the poorly cleaned and dressed wounds. Search parties would spend the remainder of the year retrieving remains out of wells, basements, and waterways, often only finding charred pieces. The town of Peshtigo Harbor and its sawmill, close enough to the coast to survive the worst of the fire, were put to work building coffins and transporting bodies to Green Bay for burial. The fire would ultimately scorch a 1.2 million acre area stretching from just north of Green Bay to Escanaba, Michigan. 17 towns would be destroyed, along with nearly 60 logging camps scattered throughout the area. Somewhere between 1,500 and 2,500 people would be killed, but we'll never know the exact total since most victims were cremated by the fire. Death would be the only legacy of the Peshtigo fire. Despite the town being rebuilt largely out of Ogden's pocket, the industry that fueled its growth never returned, and its development stalled. Even more disturbingly, officers from the United States Air Force and RAF Bomber Command would study the fire 70 years later during World War II, attempting to figure out what had become known as the Peshtigo paradigm, the exact combination of fuel load, topography, and whether that had led to the firestorm this destructive and deadly. Over cities like Hamburg, Dresden, and Tokyo, the research would be put to use. So why is this fire, the deadliest wildfire in American history, so unknown today? Well, it's simple. The same day this fire broke out, a cow kicked over a lantern in Chicago. Well, not really. The story of Mrs. O'Leary and her bovine companion's guilt regarding the Chicago fire is a fabrication born more out of anti-Irish hysteria than cold hard facts. The fact remains, though, that the loss of a major American city was never going to play second fiddle to a small lumber town in the middle of nowhere, Wisconsin, regardless of death toll. Every major newspaper had offices in Chicago, and with frontline reports already heading back to Washington, Boston, and New York before the flames were even under control, the destruction held a death grip on the front pages. It would take 2 months before reports of Peshtigo would appear in any newspapers outside of Wisconsin. Even in the state capital of Madison, Peshtigo would be an afterthought. By the time news of the Peshtigo fire had finally reached the capital on October 10th, Lucius Fairchild, Wisconsin's governor, had already ridden to Illinois to help with the relief effort. It was his wife, Frances, who was the hero of the early stages. Taking charge, she gathered food, clothing, and blankets, often stealing entire train cars of aid earmarked for Chicago and sending them north. When Lucius returned on the 12th, he would continue his efforts. A few complaints were raised because he took money from the treasury without consulting anyone in the state legislature, but as reports of Peshtigo started to flood the capital, they were silenced as his detractors sought a more PR-friendly molehill to turn into a mountain. The Peshtigo fire is a tragedy that should be remembered more, not just because of the loss of life, but because of the relevance to wildfires today. It was the first documented case of a firestorm, a phenomenon that occurs more frequently in wildfires today. With the added fuel loads from years of overgrowth, more prolonged droughts, and the rising air temperatures, it might be a matter of when, not if, another town out west suffers Peshtigo's fate.